This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 905 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, this is your final reminder about the Underdog offer that I've been talking about all summer long. If you sign up on Underdog Fantasy with promo code LATEROUND, when you make a deposit, you'll get a free copy of the Late Round Draft Guide. Some of you are still drafting this weekend, so make sure you're taking advantage of this offer. Signing up also gets you a free pick and a first-time deposit offer up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy sports. And it's also the fastest growing fantasy app in the industry. It's a great place to play. Check it all out at UnderdogFantasy.com. And remember, when you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @LloydRage. It says, what are your thoughts on Purdy now that Williams and Ayuk got paid? Your email was talking about no Trent, but that has changed. Yeah, so I want to clear this up. Because after that 15 transactions article was emailed to you guys, after you guys listened to that episode earlier this week, Trent Williams got his contract. So Trent Williams is part of the San Francisco 49ers this season. I didn't really expect that not to be the case. And honestly, I almost wish that I wouldn't have talked about Williams when talking about Purdy on the 15 transactions episode. Because it took the focus off of the most important thing, which is just general regression. I had some comments this week saying how it doesn't make any sense that Purdy would regress. Because he's got another year in this system. His weapons are essentially the same, if not better. Why would he be worse this year? Well, that's just not how regression works. Purdy himself can be just as good of a player as he was last year, maybe even a better player. But his numbers can still take a step back. I mentioned on 15 transactions that he had a 7% touchdown rate last year. That's something that no quarterback in the history of the NFL has maintained. The other thing I didn't talk about was how Purdy finished last year with a yards per attempt rate of 9.6. Among 300 plus attempt quarterbacks ever in NFL history, that number has been hit a grand total of 3 times. Kurt Warner did it in 2000, Chris Chandler, he did it in 1998, and then Brock Purdy did it in 2023. Now, Purdy may see more volume. He should see more volume this year. But volume generally doesn't offset those numbers enough. Let me just run through an example. This is just straight math, and it's where this entire take really stems from. Let's say that Purdy sees his touchdown rate fall to 6%, which is still really high. And let's say his yards per attempt rate goes to 8, which is also still quite high. Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback of this era, has a career yards per attempt of 7.9. He has a career touchdown rate of 6.1%. So we're basically saying that Brock Purdy will be Patrick Mahomes in this hypothetical, which is obviously not a given. Now, last year, Purdy averaged 18.5 points per game through the air, when you count only his yards, his passing yards, and his touchdowns. So I'm ignoring the variance of interceptions. I'm ignoring what he might do via rushing, because that's going to have a little bit of volatility given he's not a mobile quarterback. Let's just look at his passing touchdowns and his passing yards. If Purdy has a yards per attempt rate of 8 instead of 9.6 and a touchdown rate of 6% instead of 7%, in order for him to maintain that 18.5 points per game mark, he's going to need to see his pass attempts increase by over 5 attempts per game. Across a season, we're talking 85 more pass attempts. With this team and the fact that they're likely going to win a lot of games, it's going to be very hard to see that high of a total. That's almost 580 pass attempts. The 49ers have been at 491, 512, and 514 pass attempts over the last 3 years. And remember, that's with a good yards per attempt and a good touchdown rate. And guys, that's still just to get to low-end QB1 numbers. Anything is obviously possible, but my point with selling Purdy and not drafting him at cost this year is that there are other pocket passing quarterbacks who can match his ceiling. This is exactly what I mean when I say that. I would much rather throw a dart late at some of those guys than pay up at the top of a tier for a player like Purdy. And this has nothing to do with how I feel about Purdy the player. I actually like Purdy and I think that he's unfairly scrutinized. This is strictly math. This is strictly about how the game of fantasy football is played and how it's scored. This next question is from @Steven0128. It says, can you expound on why White is a sell because he's RB22 that can finish as RB18 and that still doesn't help you, but Iosivas is a buy who is wide receiver 90 but probably can't be even better than wide receiver 50 and also won't help you win a championship? Well, first off, Iosivas wasn't a buy, he was an add, which is obviously different because you're not needing to make a trade to acquire him. But there's a huge difference between adding someone off the waiver wire or even trading a random bench asset versus dealing with a player who's ranked at RB22, who was drafted relatively high in your draft. As many of you know, with my analysis, I think in terms of range of outcomes. I try to recognize the good and the bad for a player, and then I place bets, if you will. I place bets based on the optimistic and pessimistic outcomes. My point about Zamir White is that in a relatively decent outcome for him, I still don't see how he's going to return a huge value. There's still a pessimistic side to things, though. There's still a way for things to go south. Like if I were to guarantee Zamir White would be the RB18, I wouldn't have the same stance. He'd be a better pick than he is. But that's not a guarantee. I'm just telling people that I think a relatively high-end outcome, maybe like an 80th percentile outcome, that kind of outcome for Zamir White, he's going to be like the RB18. And he was drafted just below that mark. That gap, in my opinion, is not worth buying into. So the difference between a guy like White to a guy like Iosivas is cost to acquire. It actually matters if Zamir White is a dud because you're spending capital to get him. It doesn't matter if Iosivas is. There's an alternative with Zamir White right now that's significant. With White, it was all the potential running backs and wide receivers that you could have drafted instead of him, or now traded instead of him. With Iosivas, sure, his probable ceiling is not that high, but you're not paying for that ceiling. Comparing White to Iosivas is like comparing apples to chewed up gum that you found on the bottom of a bench. You can actually do something with the apples. Okay, that was a dumb analogy, but you get the point. Let's move on. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Dread Pirate Roberts. It says, hi, JJ. In years past, my post-draft bench would consist of recognizable names on the downslope of their careers with limited upside. I can see how and why that strategy plagued my teams in the past. My question is, how much of your bench should be high upside players? It makes me nervous looking at a bench of backups and hopefuls like Jalen Wright, Bucky Irving, Tajay Spears, and Rashid Shaheed. Thanks. Now, I get a lot of questions about bench management this time of year. I know I've answered some of them in the past, but I think it's worth bringing up once again, especially right before week 1 really begins. I don't think fantasy managers think enough about the waiver wire as sort of an extension of your bench. Now, obviously, depending on your league size, your league's activity, you can think about this differently. Like if you're in a 10-team league that has managers who don't even put in waiver claims each week, then you know that the waiver wire is largely yours. You can get a lot of players off the waiver wire easily. If you're in a league that's super competitive, then you can't lean on the waiver wire as much. Now, another thing to point out is that your bench, it should reflect your starting lineup. As in, wherever you're weak in your starting lineup, your bench should then be strong. If you have good wide receivers, then don't lean into wide receiver on your bench. If you have good running backs, then maybe you'll want more wide receiver flyers. But bench management is largely league dependent. Sometimes the boring veterans like a Brandon Cooks is going to be more valuable in your league than a legitimate flyer. Because maybe your league has a ton of starting roster slots. But a player like Cooks in a league that starts 2 wide receivers, he's not nearly as attractive. This is actually something that you're going to hear me talk about on the Late Round Perspectives episode today about one of my favorites this season, Jaleel McLaughlin. So really lean into your league settings and your league requirements. But generally speaking, given the majority of people who are listening to this right now, you're not in like super deep formats, I'd continue to roster high upside players on my bench as opposed to those boring veterans. You're playing for first place, not fourth place. This next question is from @SJessup1105 on Twitter. It says, what's your view on the Bears backfield throughout the season? Surprised at the fantasy community's outlook on DeAndre Swift. Between Bears camp reports that they're hyper-focusing on his pass catching and Herbert and Roschon being below average, I think he's got a higher ceiling than most. So I would disagree that Herbert and Roschon are below average, at least Khalil Herbert. On the ground, he's been one of the most efficient running backs in football since he entered the league. Now, he's not a huge threat as a receiver, but he's not super easy competition. Honestly, though, I think this is where we just need to be realistic with coach speak and the reports that we're seeing. I have no doubt that DeAndre Swift is going to see work as a pass catcher. And when we see reports saying that they are going to use him more as a receiver or that they targeted him a lot, you have to ask yourself how feasible that is. Because there's only a 100% target share to go around in that offense. And the Bears have some really, really good pass catchers. So my general worry would be the ceiling. I do think a 10, 11% target share is absolutely possible. But how much higher can that get without an injury? Like a DeAndre Swift target is not going to be more reliable or better than a DJ Moore target or a Keenan Allen target or a Rome Odunze target. More than likely, at least. So that's one thing to think about. The other is that there's a very real chance that he's not the goal line back for them. He saw a lot of work at the goal line last year for Philly despite the tush push. He converted just 28.6% of those rushes. Usually that number's closer to 40%. And we never saw him as a full-time goal line guy in Detroit. And for what it's worth, Shane Waldron's offenses in Seattle, they didn't target the running back that much. During his time there, Seattle backs ranked 30th, 27th, and 24th in running back target share. Now, clearly personnel is going to dictate that, but it's something to note. So I've actually found myself underweight on DeAndre Swift this year. I thought he should be ranked closer to like RB30, RB31. I was taking a shot on some of the true ambiguous backfields because to me, those players just have more upside. But I obviously can see how this could be wrong. If the Bears make him a bell cow or give him more work at the goal line than I'm expecting, then all of a sudden he was a great pick. We're just playing probability at the end of the day. But that's where I stand, and that's the downside case because you asked. The last question this week, it's actually a set of questions. The first one's from Bobby on Patreon. It says, "What's up, JJ? Appreciate all your hard work during the season and the offseason. Thanks. Besides the obvious big performance, how do you determine someone you want to target off the waiver wire after week one's games? Basically, what do you look for when creating your 15 transactions for the week?" Along the same lines, I got this one from @Bronton21 on Twitter. It says, "JJ, how do you decide what is a week one overreaction versus what is a potential all-in free agent budget breakout? Everyone now wishes they would have grabbed Puka last year, but we've all been burnt by one-hit wonders." Okay, so obviously we're going to take things case by case, and no two players are going to be exactly alike. But the two things we should always be focused on with our evaluation here is usage and pedigree. On the usage front, we're looking at the things that we're always looking for. Snaps, target share, backfield share for running backs. Was this guy on the field, and was he seeing looks when he was on the field? You can then take that one step further to look at the type of touches that he was seeing, or where on the field he was being deployed, all that good stuff. With pedigree, I'm referring to, based on our evidence, is this player good or not? And yeah, that's going to be a little bit more subjective. But to me, if there's an older player who's done nothing in his career, and then all of a sudden he has a big game, sure, we can add him off the waiver wire. But what are the odds that he's actually going to be a weekly starter for us? On the other hand, look at Puka Nacua last year. I talked through the Nacua stuff at length on this podcast last season. And it's a good example of this. What Nacua did in week one was historic for a rookie wide receiver. It wasn't like a Kevin Ogletree situation. Some of you might remember in week one of 2012, Kevin Ogletree, who had done very, very little during the first 3 years of his NFL career. So it was year 4 for Ogletree. He went out and he caught 8 of 11 targets for 114 yards and 2 scores in week one. That's a situation where, sure, you can go and add him. Maybe some crazy thing is going to happen for him that year. But the odds that he'd break fantasy football were so slim. Not only had he never gotten past 50 receiving yards in an NFL game prior to that, but he was an undrafted receiver. He didn't have that pedigree. There was no reason to spend up on that performance. Nacua, meanwhile, not only had some interesting marks to his prospect profile, but what he did, the usage that he saw, like I said, it was historic. You had to lean into that. And you had to lean into that more than your league mates. And that's what I talked about last year. This is not some hindsight take. This has been my process for the last handful of years on this show. Because I say this every single year, and I'm going to say it again. When a young player who has a good backbone, who has a pretty good profile, when that young player breaks out, you have to be aggressive. You're not always going to be right. Sometimes it burns you. But when you are right, you're going to get a massive, massive win. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. Don't forget there's a Late Round Perspectives episode that's dropping later today, so I hope you enjoy that. Otherwise, have a great week 1.